As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
President Biden says that Putin is losing the war in Iraq. So this is the comic relief for the day. This article is from Zero Hedge about this. So President Biden was asked on Wednesday by reporters how he thinks Putin is doing, if he thinks he's strong, or I forget exactly what the question was, but this is the president's response.
It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home, and he has become a bit of a pariah around the world. It's not just NATO. It's not just the European Union. It's Japan. It's 40 nations.
So saying that he's losing the war in Iraq, it's a Freudian slip. Very interesting because it's Biden, so he's pretty prone to gaffes. But we've seen similar things. I don't know if you remember a few months ago, or maybe it was last year at this point. I forget when exactly it was. But George W. Bush was giving a speech, and he was talking about the invasion of Ukraine, and he said because of one man's decision to launch a totally unjust invasion of Iraq. And then he said, he shook his head and he said, well, Iraq too. And then he went on to talk about Russia and Ukraine. It almost seemed like an acknowledgement that he did launch an illegal, unjust invasion. It definitely seems like it's something that's on his mind to have a slip like that. So after Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived uprising, Wagner members have the option of signing contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry, or they could travel to Belarus, or they could go home. Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, has denied rumors that they're building bases for Wagner in Belarus, but he did say that he's willing to accommodate the fighters. But at this point, it's unclear how many of them are going to end up in Belarus. But Poland is estimating that about 8,000 Wagner members are going to Belarus. And I don't know how they got that number, but that's what they're saying. And they're saying that they're going to beef up security on the Polish-Belarusian border. So Polish President Andrzej Duda wants NATO to discuss the issue at the upcoming summit in Vilnius, which will be held from July 11th to the 12th. He said, quote, "This is a really serious and very concerning, and we have to make very strong decisions. It requires a very, very tough answer of NATO," end quote. Stoltenberg said that it's too early to tell what Russia's presence in Belarus will mean for the alliance, but vowed NATO will defend every inch of its territory from threats in Moscow or Minsk. Quran burning protest in Sweden angers Turkey. So the Swedish government permitted a Quran burning protest that took place in Sweden on Wednesday, and this move, of course, angered Turkey and made it less likely that Ankara will approve Stockholm's NATO membership before the Vilnius summit in July. So Swedish police said that the approval was done in accordance with the right of free speech. Only one man took part in the demonstration, so just one guy burning a Quran near a mosque in Stockholm. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan condemned the protest. He said, quote, "It is unacceptable to allow these anti-Islamic actions under the pretext of freedom of expression. To turn a blind eye to such heinous acts is to be complicit in them," end quote. Turkey's director of communications also said that those who seek to be in NATO, quote, "cannot tolerate or enable destructive behaviors of Islamophobic and xenophobic terrorists," end quote. So earlier this year, there was another Quran burning protest in Sweden, and Turkey postponed talks with Sweden over its NATO bid because of that. So, this is definitely going to affect things, I think. U.S. and NATO officials have been hoping that Sweden will be granted their membership by July 11th, which is when the Vilnius summit will begin. But Erdogan has said that won't happen, and this protest, I think it gives them more of a reason not to sign off on it.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, the former murderer general, was in Iraq, killing people. His last job was sitting on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor in the United States, and accordingly made $7 million by sitting on board of directors before he was appointed as Secretary of Defense, has admitted that American personnel, advisors are in Ukraine because of the weaponry, and it's very complicated weaponry. We want to make sure that, it's not misused and not, yeah.
And
so
why did he admit it? Because the documents that they blamed that young kid in Massachusetts on for leaking, the authenticity and accuracy of which the government has never challenged, reveal that American troops are on the ground and reveal that Lloyd Austin and all his senior military people believe that Ukraine will lose the war. And still we're sending billions. We sent another $6 billion since you and I were on air together.
Yeah. As this country is rotting in front of us. Oh, did you see that that train on that bridge that collapsed in Montana, and all the filthy crap in the train, or all the poisons went into the water. Oh, that hardly made the news. Who cares? Everywhere you drive, boom, 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 boom. The roads are rotting. The streets are filled with homeless. Crime is on the rise. The middle class is shrinking, but yet more money going into fighting this war.
If you or I showed up in Trenton or in Albany and said, here's $100 million, now write a law that I want, we'd be arrested for bribery or attempted bribery. Congress has insulated itself, immunized itself from bribery when it bribes the states. That's an example of how Congress goes outside the Constitution. Now back to war. How does Congress go outside the Constitution? Well, it can't declare war because Russia poses no threat. But Congress can spend your money any way it wants, including spending your money on $400 million to give to the grifters in Kyiv and $60 billion to give to those same people in the form of military equipment. No, we didn't declare war, but we're giving you all the guns and ammo that you want so you can kill all the Russians that you can. You see how they lie to us because they took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and they go outside it, domestically by bribing the states, internationally by giving military material and cash to another country to fight our wars. To Victoria Nuland, to Tony Blinken, to Lloyd Austin, to Jake Sullivan, to Joe Biden. Ukraine is a battering ram to drive Putin from office. And guess what? They are not going to succeed, and they're in so deep, they don't have an off-ramp, and they don't know what to do. So what do when they don't know what to do? As you would say, as the great Gerald Celente would say, they take you to war. In this case, we're already in war. What are they going to do? Kill more people. Kill more people. That's what they do.
Article, I mean, again, this War Powers Act, this War Powers Resolution, it requires the presidential notification of Congress to use American military force. It's unconstitutional.
Of course it's unconstitutional because only Congress can authorize it. Nixon vetoed it, but it was enacted over his veto. He vetoed it for the wrong reason. He vetoed it because he felt it crimped his style. Nixon was such a lover of the presidency. He thought presidents literally could fight any war, declare any war, wage any war, the heck with Congress. But the War Powers Resolution is Congress giving away its war-making power to the president as long as he tells them about it. Then Congress forms the Gang of Eight, which is the Congress within the Congress. That's the chair and ranking member of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees and the Republican and Democrat leader of both houses of Congress. And when the president tells something to the Gang of Eight, hey, Yevgeny Prigozhin is about to march on Moscow. It's Wednesday. This is going to happen on Saturday. Can they tell anybody else in the Congress? Can they tell the press? Can they tell the people they represent? No, they're bound to secrecy. So the president can kill all he wants, can wage all the coups that he wants, as long as he tells the Gang of Eight, and they can't tell anybody. What the hell kind of a government is that makes its decisions to kill and does kill in secret?
The post-Cold War era has produced fewer greater power conflicts and instances in which to defend vital U.S. interests, yet U.S. military interventions continue at high rates and higher hostilities, the authors explained of this report that just came out. It's disgusting. The study found that over the past 2.5 centuries, 34% of U.S. interventions have been against countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, 23% in East Asia and the Pacific, 14% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 13% in Europe. What kind of country is this?
This is a country that is determined to build an empire like the Romans, and like the Romans, it will collapse of its own weight. You can add to that list the 903 foreign military installations that we have. There is no human on the planet that can name all 903 of them, except maybe the people that write the checks in Washington, D.C. to pay for it.
Quote, "He who is not angry when there is just cause for anger is immoral." Why? Because anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust.
St. Thomas Aquinas.
And we're doing everything we can to fight for freedom. And we're on the brink of nuclear annihilation. We have mentally deranged people in charge of our lives. They're satanic and demonic. That's the way I see it. And think for yourself. I mean, how come they don't talk about peace?
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Last summer, the California General Assembly passed this law that says that if a doctor gives misinformation to a patient about COVID, that doctor can be disciplined by the state and even have his or her license revoked by the state. And it is specific to COVID. And you might ask, well, what's misinformation? What counts as misinformation under this law? Well, the law says that's anything that goes against the contemporary scientific consensus. And that might make you wonder, well, how do you know what that is? And indeed, who does know what that is? Because the official consensus on so many issues related to COVID has changed over and over. And as a result of this, you have doctors in California who don't know what they can and can't say to their patients if they want to avoid risking their license.
Yeah, so they can have their licenses revoked if it's discovered that they gave some medical advice or said something that runs against, as you say, the consensus. And the consensus, as you're indicating, the very concept, the word itself should almost send a shiver up your spine after what we've been subjected to for the past 3 years, because yesterday's misinformation is today's consensus, and vice versa. I mean, from the very beginning, when we were told that New York City needed 40,000 ventilators, and then one doctor made an amateur video saying at his house, saying, I actually think that the ventilators are counterproductive. And suddenly it turned out that, oh yeah, we don't need 40,000 ventilators because the ventilators are actually causing a lot of the problem. So that quote unquote consensus went out the window just like that. So you would think if we were dealing with reasonable people who were actually dedicated to health and to the well-being of others, that they would take an open-minded approach. They would say, obviously, with something like this, it's been quite elusive. We expected that harsh non-pharmaceutical interventions like lockdowns and masks would accomplish a lot. They apparently didn't. So again, we have to be a little bit modest in the kinds of things that we predict will happen or the kinds of authoritative statements we make. You would think we would hear something like that rather than whatever the fleeting consensus of the moment is, that's what you have to subscribe to on penalty of losing your license. But here we are.
Yeah, right. You'd think that's what they would say if we were ruled by rational, decent people. But of course we aren't, and especially people in California aren't. And of course, this law is anti-free speech, of course, because it seeks to control what doctors can and can't say. And you do have a right to free speech if you're practicing medicine, just like you have it anywhere else. And it's also, of course, inherently anti-science because the state is going to decide what counts as the right answer right now, and it's going to impose that on everybody. And you can't even talk about the alternatives with your patients. And so these doctors are in a really difficult position now if they want to be able to give patients their honest advice. And of course, it's not just these two who represent in these lawsuits. We've heard from many, many doctors across California who are very concerned about this. Some of them thinking about just picking up and moving to another state because it's essentially impossible right now for them to practice medicine the way that they believe they should in California. The Liberty Justice Center actually was the first organization, the first group to challenge that OSHA vaccine mandate. We saw it coming and we looked for someone who would be willing to stand up to this. We were fortunate to connect with a man who owns some grocery stores in Louisiana named Brandon Trosclair. And so as soon as that mandate went into effect, we were filing in court at 6 a.m. or something like that to get that challenge on file with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. When you do that sort of thing, you go straight to the appeals court. And immediately, if essentially the Fifth Circuit issued a stay against that mandate nationwide so that nobody had to comply with it. Ultimately, there were a bunch of other people who challenged this, and the Supreme Court agreed that this was unlawful, that OSHA has no authority to prescribe a vaccine mandate for employees. And so, fortunately, it never went into effect, although, of course, lots of people had to scramble and think about what other job they were going to take when they assumed it was going to go into effect.
And of course, no doubt, there are a great many companies, especially larger ones, that prefer to be in the good graces of the government. And if they know this is a policy the government wants enforced, they might just carry it out anyway. So even with the official coercive mandate gone, you still had employers saying, well, we need to do it. And it didn't matter to them what the science behind it was. You could argue all day long to them that this had no health effects whatsoever, and all you're doing is disrupting people's lives, and it just didn't seem to do anything.
Yeah, that's right. And this current situation where you have the federal government pressuring private entities so much, even when there isn't an official formal rule, creates something of a problem for a libertarian lawyer like me, because as a general matter, I don't want to go to court and tell a private business what kind of rules it can prescribe for its employees, even rules that I think are outrageous. I think a private employer should be allowed to have as a general matter. And so then you have these things that you see companies doing. You see companies imposing vaccine mandates. You see the social media platforms censoring people. And you know, if it wasn't for federal government pressure, they wouldn't be doing it. But if you can't prove that the government effectively made them do it, then you're going to court and just trying to stop a private business from doing something. And I don't want case law on the books saying it's okay to tell private employers what kinds of rules they can have. So it's a little bit of a conundrum for the libertarian lawyer right now. And I think the trick is to find those instances where you can show that the government played a critical role in making the private business do what it did. And so that's looking right now in a case against not only the Biden administration, but also Facebook and Twitter.
Congress asked Merrick Garland if he withheld permission or interfered with potential prosecutions or denied potential prosecutions in Delaware or in California. Why California in a minute? And he said no. The whistleblowers say yes, and that they can prove it. This is very serious. The interference is, if it happened, is lawful, but needs to be revealed. But if this attorney general of ours, a federal judge for 29 years, lied under oath, that is a very, very, very serious problem, and he may very well have to appoint a special counsel to investigate himself, in which case he would probably resign from office. Why California? Because Hunter Biden was living in California 1 year when these alleged violations of federal law involving the IRS took place. And the Constitution requires not only DOJ regulations, but the Constitution requires that a person be charged in the judicial district where the crime is alleged to have occurred. Why is that in the Constitution? Because the British government charged colonists with crimes and then shipped them to London for prosecution. So when Madison wrote the Constitution, he wanted to be sure that that would never happen here. So the Constitution specifically says you must be charged in the judicial district in which the government says the crime took place. So now there's a lot of pressure on this judge to reject the guilty plea. The judge was nominated by President Trump, but the judge has also contributed to Hillary Clinton's campaign. So we don't know what's going to happen. I don't like the idea of evaluating judges on the basis of their prejudicial politics. Having been a life tenure judge, though, on the state side, I can tell you your attitude about politics and about the government changes radically once you put that lifetime black robe on. You really don't care about the politics, even the politics that help you get to the judgeship. You have a profound intellectual obligation to be intellectually honest. The politics be damned. So I don't care if Trump appointed her or if she gave money to Hillary. She has an obligation to be intellectually honest. If she can't, then she's got to get off the case and pass it on to somebody else.
And the questions are growing about the dealings, the millions of dollars that apparently have gone to all these shell companies, all of these different accounts, millions and millions, as the chairman of the committee said. I don't know if the walls are closing in on Biden. They kept saying that about Trump for years, but it does make you wonder what's going on next with Biden.
Yes, and there's so much, it's corruption. They live in a different world because I don't think they lie awake at night and say, boy, I sure wish I could get out of this dealing all this corruption. How can I hide it better and get more? It goes on and on. But as bad as what Biden has done, with his personal finance and personal benefits, I see the biggest corruption is the interference in the weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI. That's when you have a crooked cop.
Yeah.
And that is supposed to be the worst type of system because that will destroy a nation or a city or a town or a state if the police are crooked. And I think, the police forces at the border going south aren't thought to be run by honorable people. And look at the chaos there. So if you can't trust the legal authorities, they're worse than having none. Because if there were absolutely none, I think there would be people, and if it were legal to have privatized, discipline and policing activity, it would work out. But when it's official and it's there and it's the FBI and they're respected and people want to be patriotic and they don't want to criticize, it's so important that this to me, when that is corrupted, it's a downhill slide, and people who want to speak the truth are the enemy. They're the ones who get the worst of the blame. It's the biggest thing. But the other thing in combination with this that is a real problem is the people that do it, lack some natural instincts to have a conscience about it.
Yeah.
They have no conscience. I don't believe they have a feeling of guilt. Can anybody imagine that Hillary has a lot of trouble and seeing a psychiatrist? How am I going to handle my guilt?
Yeah, no. That's a problem.
It doesn't happen. but they don't show, they aren't embarrassed. You know, like Hunter, he showed that he was still in charge. He goes to the state dinner and appears, I'm still it. I haven't lost any mileage at all. And but they seem to have just no conscience at all. And it to me is a reflection of a society that has accepted nihilism, where they just give up. Truth is too difficult. It's hard to follow the truth, and it's hard to agree on it. And there is a certain amount of that. The truth is not an absolute. Everybody could say ABC and that's the truth and just shut up and don't talk. Truth is something you seek and you pursue, and you're either pursuing it or you're destroying it. And I think for 100 years, but more likely in the last 20 or so, that the systematic approach to destroying the whole principles of truth is our number one problem in the country, applied, socially, economically, religiously, the whole way, internationally too. That is what would have to be addressed if we want to see some improvement. So I like to see articles like this that are trying to point out the nonsense, even though this is a personal thing that we're talking about right now. I still think that it fits the pattern, and we should pay attention.
So, and this is what he wrote in his column. I think it's kind of take off on what we were saying. This is why many people miss the point of Hunter Biden showing up after his criminal plea to a state dinner. That's what you pointed out. And he Shirley continues, it was shocking for many to see Hunter whining and dining with the Washington elite. However, that is precisely the point. It was a collective celebration for a city where influence peddling is a cottage industry. Despite overwhelming evidence of corruption, Hunter was back in circulation. I think he was thinking on our lines.
No wonder we respect Jonathan.
Yeah. I think he gets it for sure.
No, that is something. And I think it's important. You say, well, that's just a detail. If you do get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse, everything's going to be better. But my debate went that, yes, you can try, and we should do it, and we shouldn't be against getting rid of it, but it won't solve the whole problem. And I think Jonathan understands that very clearly.
Switzerland cites neutrality, pardon me, in blocking nearly 100 German tanks for Ukraine. So the initial plan, they got a bunch of junky tanks that they're storing in Italy. God knows what they're like. They're out of commission. They were going to spruce them up a bit, send them over to Germany, and Germany was going to go ahead and send them to Ukraine. Well, the Swiss parliament said no because of our stance on neutrality. They said this would be inconsistent with applicable law concerning arms deliveries in an active conflict zone. So they nixed those 100 tanks to Ukraine.
Yeah, and the policy is mixed too, because they are giving up in their tradition, and yet they thought, well, we can't do this, so we'll get them refurbished in Germany. Probably with American money. Reagan and I knew each other, and I knew him better than any of the presidents, but I didn't have any really close conversation. But I had a few. I was at the Gold Commission at the Treasury, and we were both going to be with him and other congressmen flying to Houston for a political event. So staff said, well, maybe you should ask the president to take you out on a helicopter. And the staff set that up. I was surprised. But it's interesting. Reagan knew I was at the Gold Commission and came out, and he was sort of philosophic. He says, any great country or decent country that goes off the gold standard no longer remains great. And he was referring to great nations. But you could use that. Switzerland was great because it had a policy that was different. I can remember, I know at least as a teenager, I could hear my parents talking about it, talking about, well, there's two countries in the world that are neutral. They don't get involved in these wars. At least appearance of that. So, but then they went back, and now the system has changed, and it gets worse. Now they support all the sanctions. This thing, they're not hesitating by sanctions because some of the progressives, they say, well, we won't send troops, but we're going to put a lot of sanctions on them, and not being willing to see the point that sanctions, in a way, is an act of war. It's like a blockade. You're trying to punish some country, and that I think is missed, because that is not an excuse. It's not a nice, safe in between, because I would be willing to wager that if you took all the sanctions, that the sanctions led to worse troubles and more likely hostilities than no sanctions.
And this is what caught both of our attention. I didn't send it to you because I thought you probably would already have read it and thought this is interesting. But the great quote from this town hall was, quote, "Our country will start healing when the government tells the truth."